Good morning, colleagues. It's really good to be back here at MUT again for another year and another round. Maybe to begin first, to say I regret that I wasn't here yesterday for the workshops. I took the opportunity to look through the program, and I really think there was some, from what I read, some really important and engaging ideas that were brought up. Secondly, I'm not sure if Professor Logan Naidu is here. Is Professor Logan Naidu here? There he is. I think it was yourself, sir, if my memory serves correctly, last year, during my presentation on graduate attributes, that you raised the question of decolonization, of letting go of issues. And while last year we didn't really have an opportunity to engage on that topic significantly, it set me on a path of beginning to think about transformation, and I'm beginning to think about what does decolonization mean, and lastly to begin also to think about what we might be talking about in terms of what's the future trajectory for us in terms of ensuring the success of our students. So on the basis of that, I'd like to thank you, Professor Naidu, because I think last year you got a bit of short shrift, if you remember. We moved on quickly. It was a new topic. For myself, in terms of my own journey, last year I had the opportunity to do a transformation audit of the University of the Free State. Everybody knows where that is, I assume, and knows what happened in 2010, 28, 29, somewhere, with the REITs incident of the students. And it was interesting to go and do a transformation audit of that university in the middle of last year. And the week we went, Professor Jonathan Jansen resigned, not because of us, by the way, but simply he decided it was time to move on. But it was an opportunity, together with Professor Bani Pichana, the former Vice-Chancellor of UNISA, together with Professor Crane Sudeen, who you remember wrote the Sudeen report or was the chair of that panel, and for us to engage with the university really about substantive issues around what does transformation mean in the years post our liberation, in the democracy in the country. And so it's on the basis of that today I would like to express some ideas around that to engage with you. Let me declare up front, Professor Ramokhala Baba, after listening to you, I'm feeling the pain of the last week in our country. And the pain that I'm feeling is, how are we as South Africans going to ensure that the poor do not suffer more and are further made to suffer because of how we as a society are behaving and continuing, and how leadership. And so that really is a bit of the background also to my own emotion and my own feeling about how do we share and take responsibility, not only for education, Professor Ramokhale, but for ourselves as a nation, as a society, because I think the discussion on transformation speaks to that. So just for those of you who might get distracted with your emails or your phones, just that you know some way of the pathway we're going to follow. The first is the University Transformation Agenda. I was on the TUT University Council for a number of years, and the Vice-Chancellor asked if I would move off council as a ministerial appointee and come and work with the university to think about transformation, and to be the advisor to the Vice-Chancellor, to provide strategic support, and not to do the transformation, but as an outsider to come in and ask some of the questions. So I want to talk about a little bit of that journey that TUT is walking at the moment. Secondly, when we talk about transformation, what do we mean? And I saw in the last presentation there, radical economic transformation. And again, what do we mean by that? What's the significance of that? Thirdly, a new transformation narrative, the academic project, and student success, and some thoughts and reflections around that. Transforming the curriculum, Professor Ramokhale, I'm so glad you're here, decolonization, and to give kind of some initial thoughts from myself on that, And then what next for student success? When I went to TUT last year in August, the Vice-Chancellor said, begin a discussion, do something to help us to begin to think about transformation. So up till now, I've spoken in a university of 60,000 students, 3,400 full-time staff. I've only spoken to about 250 people. But to talk about what does transformation mean, and is there a shared understanding of transformation at TUT? What is your working definition of transformation? What are the various areas that come together in thinking about transformation? And maybe for yourself, if you're coming from a university context, to think about what would a transformed university look like? What would your university look like? How would you recognize it? From what, another way of asking, saying, from what to what? And in the last 20-something years of our democracy in South Africa, what have been the achievements in your university? And then lastly, and that's where everybody started, what are the long-term, short-term challenges and actions to be taken across the university right now to advance transformation? And I do remember there was one colleague that I met, and he said, why are you here? And many of my conversations were one-on-one. And I said, to talk about your understanding, he said, I don't want to talk to you. I said, that's fine. It's okay with me. If the Vice-Chancellor calls you and asks you, then just be prepared to respond. And he said, but by the way, what is it you're really here to talk about? And I started to talk about what does transformation mean? We're 20-something years in our democracy. Our universities and our country needs to transform. One of the longest conversations, 2.5 hours later, he was still talking once we got started. And as we went along, I started off with 5 words on this table. In the center is a transformed university. And the blue circle represents somewhat a systems thinking approach. Everything is interconnected. And the 5 words that I had up there on the screen was leadership, teaching and learning, research, community engagement, administration. And that's where I started in August. And as I went along, different colleagues started to add in and to say, if we want our university to be transformed, we need to think about governance and the transformation of our governance structure in the university. We have 1,001 policies, but many of those policies either are totally out of date or don't serve transformational purposes. Or worse, we have policies that have been put in place because somebody did something, and so we said, let's write a policy to address it. And what we need to do is radically change all of the policies and review them. We also looked at other issues such as student governance, our policies, our procedures. In what way do they advance transformation? Going along, management, leadership. The critique that was made, and I can say that because the executive management know it. How strategic is our executive management, or is it just too operational? And the leaders of the deans, the HODs, and the directors across the institution, in what ways are they being transformational through being strategic? Teaching and learning, curriculum transformation. Internationalization, what does that mean in terms of transformation? Research, what kind of research are we doing that speaks to what does transformation mean? Community engagement, engaging in mutual relationships with communities around us. In what way is that transformational? And how does that feed into our research and feed into our teaching, learning, and the kinds of graduates we want to produce? In what ways does human resources, finance, and the support services in the university transform in a way that supports the transformation of the university? Our residences, where the students are. In what way are our residences transformational? Student affairs, the registrar's environment. When students and their parents come to register, how do we receive them? How do we treat them? In what ways are we being transformational in the way we engage and empower them? But all of these things are really underpinned, and you can see that on the squiggle at the side there, by a moral and ethical stance. If we want to transform our universities, it needs to be underpinned by a moral and ethical stance. If we want to transform our country, should I go there? No. Critical self-reflection, the ability to reflect on our practice, on our values, and what we're doing. And thirdly, a respectful and safe space, physical, mental, interpersonal, and organizational. How often do we hear in universities people say, I'm afraid to speak out, I'm afraid to because you know what will happen if I speak out. You know what my HOD will do, you know what my director will do, you know what the DVC will do, you know what the Vice Chancellor will do. And so transformation is also about helping each other to become liberated. And we as South Africans, and Professor Ramokhale spoke about that earlier, maybe we as South Africans had an impression of ourselves as exceptions, while we're learning that we ain't. But one thing that I've noticed about South Africans, we're not frightened to put issues on the table in front. When I was in Australia, I used to say, this is a burning issue, this is an issue. After the meeting, people come and say, but you can't do that. You don't be that, you're not that explicit. You've got to do it nicely and put the issues on the table. And I say the South African way is what? Say it like it is and put it out there. And then we deal with it. Those of us who were students in the 70s and 80s, do you remember the whole notion of I have a burning question? And what that meant when you asked that to your professor or lecturer? Things come to a standstill. This is a burning question. It might have nothing to do with what's going on, but it's a burning question about taking each other seriously. And so as we go along, a couple of things that have emerged at TUT, and it's going to be a pathway that the university is going to have to walk. In September, we're going to have a transformation summit for the university, for an internal conversation, to put things on the table, let people speak to it. The idea of the university. What is a university? What is the role of the university in South Africa, in Africa, globally? Has it changed? Is it changing? What models are we using for that? Who are the leaders of the academic project? I think a lot of academics, and I'm not sure if that's true of you, a lot of us are feeling that the academic project has been driven by the administrators. HODs and deans feel disempowered in terms of leading the academic project, the intellectual project of the university. And it's the finance department that turns around and says, no, you're not getting funding for that. So where is the academic project being driven from? Isn't that the traditional role of a senate, the intellectual leadership in the university? But again, in terms of transformation, where does that center itself? And the notion of students in the center. What really is the idea of the university? Are we simply producing graduates for the marketplace? Or are there other purposes that we want to explore in terms of not only students and good graduates for life and critical citizens, and people will be leaders in society, but also to have not only our students in the center, but to think about the intellectual project in the way that what we do contributes to society and is transformative for society. It's interesting, Professor Bon, I just would like to acknowledge you and welcome you here as other international guests. There's been a lot in the South African media about Zuma must go. And I had a friend from Chicago and said, well, if your President Zuma goes, can he please take Donald Trump with him? Comprehensive transformation of the curriculum. Campus spaces, that it's not only what goes on in the classroom, but the campus environment that makes our graduates what they are, and our sport, and our social life in universities. One of the things that's been coming through strongly is the notion of work ethic and attitudes of our staff in universities. What is our work ethic? What is the attitude of academics to the students in the classroom? What is it in terms of the support and administrative staff to students and to each other? We call that institutional culture. In the last few years, we've had 2 higher education summits. The first was in 2010, and it focused on debating the need for a broader understanding of transformation and a better fit between policy and practice at the institutional level. Maybe 1 or 2 of you were at that at CPUT in Cape Town in 2010. And then 5 years later, in 2015, Minister Nzimande called another meeting and said, now we're 5 years later, we're 20 years into our democracy, or more than 20 years. How are our universities transforming as truly South African universities? And it was in the context of the heightened social and political activism. Fees must fall, roads must fall, outsourcing must fall, everything must fall. And this growing activism is fueled, and it continues to be fueled now by the frustration of students, the frustration of staff and other stakeholders about the slow pace of transformation in our universities. It's kind of interesting if you ask, and we ask ourselves, so what is your working definition of transformation? What does it mean? And for us in our South African context, it takes us back to the 1997 white paper on higher education, on the transformation of our system, of our higher education system. And there in bold, it says, building a non-racial, non-sexist higher education system with redress for previously disadvantaged groups, expanding access, community engagement, academic freedom, autonomy, accountability, and responsiveness to the needs of society, the economy, and of individual students, and linking education and work. And in 1997 already we had that as a definition. And in the last 15 years, I've done probably most of the quality audits of the universities in our country. And I don't want to pick out particular institutions, but I want to give 2 examples of how important transformation is in our universities. The one is from an English former HAI, historically advantaged institution, English speaking. And how did it work? The secretary would invite the professors and the lecturers and the academics to meetings. But for some reason, most often, the black academics and professors and the women academics just didn't get the invitation. Oh, we forgot to invite you. What does that say about transformation? Move to a former historically advantaged institution, an Afrikaans-speaking one. How did that work as an institutional culture in terms of transformation? The white professors would meet, look at the agenda, decide on the outcome, and come into the meeting and drive the decision through that they had decided on. Is there a question that we needed to transform, that we needed to change? Certainly, indeed, there was, and there is, and there remains the challenge to transform, just at the level of culture in our universities. The minister established some years ago the Ministerial Oversight Committee on Transformation. Professor Mokgoba was the first chair of that. Now it's the Vice-Chancellor of NMU. No, the double M has disappeared, I think. Yeah, Derek Swartz. The common challenges are disempowering and alienating institutional cultures which frustrate transformation, poor equity profiles, poor staff qualifications, but going on an imitative approach to knowledge production, poor understanding of the nature of our students and staff, failure to confront the politics of epistemology. And I want to say fundamentally, in higher education, if we want to transform, it's fundamentally political. Not politics in terms of party politics or national politics, but it is a political exercise that we have to go through in our own institutions. And it goes on this Ministerial Oversight Committee, which was not well received by a number of people in some universities. These challenges are linked to recalcitrant colonial apartheid values and whiteness culture, Eurocentrism. And you can imagine where the kickback was coming from in such a statement. The Oversight Committee called for a new narrative, a new story about transformation in our universities. They said in the 2015 Higher Education Summit on Transformation, after 21 years, the time is ripe for a new narrative, one that confronts our reality. Africans in Africa living through a globalizing world and places knowledge at the center of transformation. I don't know if you've seen the document that was released in December by the South African Human Rights Commission. All universities had until about the 31st of March to respond to the recommendations of the Human Rights Commission. Because it's a Chapter 9 institution, we're all obligated to respond to that, and they've extended the timeline since then. But the South African Human Rights Commission was very clear in terms of we face deeply entrenched inequalities in all spheres of our society, including our public universities. Despite notable progress made, patterns of systemic exclusion, marginalization, and discrimination persist across our system. And I was wondering, seeing as we're being hosted by Mangosuthu University of Technology, would that be true for this university as well? And the Human Rights Commission asserted that public universities have not sufficiently transformed in the last 20 years. Discrimination remains prevalent in public universities, particularly on the grounds of race, gender, disability, and socioeconomic class. And despite the gains, the change has been relatively slow for all of us. What really does it mean to transform? But most particularly, if we take the curriculum and take the student in the center, what does it mean to transform our university spaces, our culture, our education, and who we are as staff? I had a dilemma for today. Last year, I played 3 videos. Do you remember that, those of us who were here? And kind of inspiring messages through song. This year, and I didn't tell Dr. Makua, but I didn't want to use a PowerPoint presentation. Because I think as academics we have lost something. I think as people who are involved with students have lost something. And that we've turned to use technology. PowerPoint, it used to be the chalkboard, then the whiteboard, and then the overhead projector. Remember that, the overhead projector days? I think we've lost the contact with our students, that face-to-face eyeball with our students, and we teach to a curriculum, but we don't engage with our students. Does that make sense to you? And I think that's a real problem for us. We think the technology will do it. We think giving them prescribed books will do it. We think getting up, and the scariest part is I see still here it goes on, academics come in and read out the book. And academics who don't want to engage with students and their questions. And more so academics who don't want to deal with the burning issues of the day about social issues or political issues when students say, what do you think? How do we think through this? And as academics, we've lost what maybe most of us have gained is modeling in our professor or our lecturer how to think through an issue, how to reason through an issue, how to use evidence to come to a point. And many academics go into a classroom and actually for many, or for some, They actually don't want to engage with the students because it's too scary now. It's scary to engage with students because they really ask us the tough questions. We do need a new transformation narrative, I think, for student success. Massification is forcing us to think very differently about how many of us in this room went through our university education. We have to think differently about all of that. We're required to put measures in place to respond to new circumstances in the area of teaching and learning. The university, the university people, have yet to recognize that we cannot carry on as we have done for the last 20 or 30 years. And many of our academics who've been in the system for that period of time, many of them haven't recognized and acknowledged that yet. What worked in providing teaching and learning in an elite university system is no longer appropriate or desirable in our democratic era. And we have to think differently about who and what we are and the nature of the students and the nature of our staff and what we're all about. So this includes the integration of all the domains or functional areas within the university. I've been saying in my own university, and with respect, Professor Ramohale, the security guard at the gate is not any less important than the Vice-Chancellor, because both have fundamentally the same task: to participate, to model, to shape, and to assist students to become the best they can be. And if the security person at the gate doesn't understand her or his role as being part of a university staff to produce good graduates for society, for life, for the economy, for their families, then we have failed in transforming ourselves. How many of us come through the gates often, and the security guard is just the security person? What does it tell us about our values and our acknowledgement and recognition of each other as human beings and of persons, and of being part of a shared team that provides education to our students, our future graduates? What does it mean if a student comes for registration and is treated disrespectfully and is dismissed? To use the South Africanism, you go to Home Affairs, and as you get to the window, the person says, "It's tea time." And they just turn and walk away. Do you know what I'm talking about? Or a student, a master's student, wants to see the HOD about something, makes 3 appointments, and each time the HOD is either not there or too busy to see the student, even though appointments have been made. Is this real? Damn sure it's real. What is it telling us about ourselves and the integratedness across the university of all the functions, from the residences to student support, to the facilities management and keeping campus clean? It's all of that is about transformation. And the message that needs to be driven home, it's not just what happens in the classroom. That's the academic's job. That's the professor, that's the lecturer's job. No, it's all of our jobs. The implications of transformation is understood from various radical perspectives. What does transformation mean in terms of racial, gender, social, cultural, sport, internationalization, academic, administrative? What does all of that mean for us in terms of taking a radical view of all of it? And give you an example. There's 2 issues that I think are of concern that I'm seeing emerging in a number of institutions. One is tribalism. KZN is my home province, so excuse me for a moment. We will only employ Zulu-speaking people in this university. And if you're from another province, I suga hamba. Tribalism. It's back to the idea and the notion of being a university. And the second one is we don't want any foreigners to teach in our university. We must be South Africans that teach. And what does that say about the nature of the project of what does it mean to be? Now, I understand it's complicated, but what does it mean to be a university that is universal? And how do we balance that? Are we becoming either tribal or nationalistic as South Africans? Or as I heard someone say, we're black at the top and we're black at the bottom, now we must get everybody else black and everybody else must get out. How long do I have, Joe? 25 minutes. He's telling me to hurry up. Something in terms of our Constitution, because that's where we come back to as a country. The Bill of Rights, Chapter 2 of the Constitution. Human dignity and respect for others. The national values of inclusion and respect and human dignity. And what does that mean in terms of transformation in our country? So it means that the curriculum and teaching and learning needs to be shaped by the redefinition of who we understand the student to be and the values that we hold up as a nation, located here in South Africa, but as part of Africa. So to transform the curriculum, it seems to me we have to think about what is the nature of the curriculum? What is the purpose of a curriculum? What is it meant to do? How do we socialize students as part of a national effort to transform the country? The support of students for success, both academically and personally. I get very worried when I think that the only purpose of people getting a degree is to be able to do a job. Surely there needs to be a much wider understanding of being a decent human being who's ethical, respectful, inclusive, is part of a collective of society, as a leader in society. Academic standards and the provision of quality. It's also about changing perspectives on assessment. Whoever said that the only way to assess is formative, summative, tests, exams, assignments? Do we not need to rethink about that a little bit? What's the curriculum? What are we actually doing and why are we doing it? Because it's always been done. And if you don't do it, your graduates will never be recognized by business and industry, and they will not employ them. Do we not have to put that on the table and talk about it? And the use of technology, and more so for those of us who are from universities of technology. How do we use technology not only in the educational process, but how do we skill up our students to use technology appropriately in their qualifications and therefore in their future work experiences? Embedding innovation and taking risks. Recently, the executive management at TUT, we had a discussion on our risk appetite and the danger of only doing things that will not involve any risks. But how many failures have led to huge successes? And therefore, do we not need to think about sometimes we have to take risks? Calculated ones, intelligent ones, but take risks in terms of innovation, take risks in terms of curriculum. How many failures led to enormous and tremendous successes as the lessons learned from them fed through? Facilitating responsible citizenship and a human rights culture. Internationalization, enabling the employability of graduates and fostering graduate attributes. And last year we spoke a bit about graduate attributes. How do we embed those? But how far that is still away from many of our academics in the classroom. Our universities are increasingly and are expected to explore the various dimensions of what a transformed curriculum might mean. What does it look like? And how does it link to the institutional vision and mission? And we will need, and Professor Ramokhale already said that, to develop a shared understanding of what a transformed curriculum and transformed pedagogy will mean in universities. And we all need to begin to do that. We can't any longer hide behind trying to avoid what does it mean of how we embed local epistemologies and the content of what constitutes Africanization and decolonization in the curricula, across all faculties and across all programs. And there are places in our universities where this is being done. It's not that it's not being done. There are pockets where it's happening already. I want to speak for a moment just briefly about language. And the notion of language is that if we eliminate our local languages and go right to the end where it's bolded, transformation includes the validation of a delegitimated knowledge for which language is the medium. If we exclude our languages, our local languages, and that's the danger of English as an imperialist language. There is a danger of just using English. And people say, yes, it's the language of business and commerce, but there's a richness in language that would be lost. It creates the intellectual environment and the means to explore ideas. Universities are to continually seek to balance these imperatives of local languages to pursue the path of transformation. And we've got to hold that together. We can't avoid it. Think about for yourself for the moment when you have a particular idiom or proverb in your own home language, and how when you try and put it into another language, sometimes it gets lost. The other one is to tell a joke. Some jokes don't translate well. Do you know what I'm talking about? Hey. It's back then to how then do we bring language, and we know all the studies that have been done about students who study in a third, fourth, or fifth language, and how that hinders them. And we have to engage with that. That's about curriculum transformation. Let me move Tron a bit faster now, because I'm going to get shot in a moment. And move on to Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Decolonizing the mind. So let me just go back a bit. He said in a recent lecture at Wits University in Johannesburg, use English, but don't let English use you. In the colonial conquest, language did to the mind what the sword did to the body of the colonized. Accents for access. While African leaders perfected their accents, Europeans sharpened tools for access to their resources. It is not African languages that threaten English, but post-colonial African policymakers will often insist that they do. If you know all the languages of the world but not your mother tongue, that is enslavement. Knowing your mother tongue and all other languages too is empowerment. Achille Mbembe says, decolonizing a la Ngugi is not about closing the door to European or other traditions. It's about defining clearly what the center is, and for Ngugi, Africa has to be placed at the center. Now I'm interested to watch Professor Ramokhale's face. Education is a means of knowledge about ourselves. After we've examined ourselves, we radiate outwards and discover peoples and the world around us, with Africa at the center of things, not existing as an appendix. You're the third world. Do you remember that from the 80s, that discourse? The center and the periphery? Who the hell put the center in the center and said we were the periphery? As a satellite of other countries or other literatures, things must be seen from an African perspective. On this notion of decolonizing the mind, and I don't want to strict speakly to Ngugi's notion of that. I want to kind of play around a little bit with that. We have to be decolonized, all of us, from the slavery of how we've been made to think in certain ways. Whether you're from Africa or Europe or whatever, we need to be decolonized. And I want to refer to two philosophers. My background's a little bit in philosophy. The first one is a German philosopher, Hans Georg Gadamer. And in 1960, Gadamer was trying to understand, how do we come to know things? And he wrote his seminal book called Truth and Method in 1960. And his basic point is about horizonality. I don't want to get into the philosophy of that, but to say, and this is what I picked up 30 years ago, it depends where you stand as to what you see. Let me put that more practically. If I'm standing this way, facing this way, this is what I see. You are not there. And my horizon, which is my history and my culture, is my horizon. And unless I'm aware that I have a horizon in my life, I can't step out of that horizon to think differently. I need to move out of the slavery of my own horizon. And his second point that he makes, Gadamer, he says, we need a fusion of horizons. When I meet you, I have my horizon. And he calls it your history and your culture. But when I meet you, you have your horizon. And as our two horizons overlap, there we meet truth. There we meet truth. And there we become decolonized. Because I don't absolutize and internalize my apartheid education, my colonialist education. The fact that as a white person and as a male, my privilege that I received in the past and still continue to benefit from. Does this make sense to you? Are you following me? The second person that I want to talk to is somewhat a disciple of, not a disciple, he worked with Gadamer and they had conversations, is Jürgen Habermas, the Frankfurt Critical School. And if you look at the history of both men, they kind of incorporated all kinds of traditions and ways of thinking and philosophers and sociologists and political scientists. What is interesting is just another thought, and that is Habermas. His basic question for me in his book of 1968, Knowledge and Human Interest. And the basic question is this: whose interest is being served by this knowledge? Whose interest? Who first of all says that that's knowledge? Who then determines that knowledge? And whose interest is being served by that? Let me move into another space of my own life. I'm a professional theologian by training, so be careful of people like me. How many churches and religious traditions indoctrinate and brainwash, am I being hard here? A particular way of thinking, and if you step out of that, you're going to go to hell. You are so going to burn. Knowledge and human interest is, and his second book of Jürgen Habermas is his Theory of Communicative Action, 1981. It's a 2-volume. His Theory of Communicative Action. How do we use knowledge and human interest, and how do we use communication for one purpose, says Habermas, to emancipate? He comes from a very strong Marxist background. You'll pick that up. Whose interest is being served? The means of production, all of that. But whose interest is being served, and in what ways does knowledge and communicative action act as an instrument of liberation or of oppression? We have to decolonize our minds. Are you with me still, or have I lost you? Or have you lost me? I don't know which. All, and this is still carrying on now with Achille, all other things are to be considered in their relevance to our situation and their contribution towards understanding ourselves. In suggesting this, we're not rejecting other streams, especially the Western stream. We are clearly mapping out the direction and perspective the study of culture and literature will inevitably take in the African university. And okay, it's within a particular context of language and literature and so on, but I think it covers everything else too. So for student success, what has to happen? We need to decolonize our minds, and goodness knows, how do we decolonize our academics' minds? If you've got the answer to that. There's an academic, Joel Modiri, he teaches jurisprudence at the University of Pretoria. And he wrote an article on the 16th of October. And in it he said, do you remember that young student from Cape Town? I think she was a first or second year student in science, and says, we must throw out all science and we must start from nothing and build our knowledge. And I don't know if Joel Modiri is a professor, doctor, or whatever, but he said, I can understand that a student in first or second year can do that, because students do it. They make absolute statements, they don't understand, they generalize. He says, but what I can't understand is an academic who says, I reject decolonization outright. That's inexcusable. Because the nature of the academic project is to engage with it and to think it through and think about it. And I really agree with him. And there's many academics who say, this decolonization thing is a waste of time, throw it out, get rid of it. We can't do that, I don't believe. Engage with the implications of epistemic coloniality and post-colonial theory. I don't know if you know the book by Sabelo and Ndlovu from UNISA, The Coloniality of Power. It's a short little book, but speaks about how colonization continues through the coloniality of power still being exercised over us today. Reflexivity, using the notion from anthropology, to be reflexive, to introspect and critique myself, my own thinking, my own ways. Operating in the post-truth world. I don't know who brought that about. Was it Trump? I don't know. But we have to move to a stance of working towards credibility, openness, transparency. The curriculum doesn't stand as an independent entity on its own. It's part of who we are. And so how do we help not only ourselves, but our academics to engage in this space? And it's a return to the first principles as academics. Remember I said just now about not wanting to do a PowerPoint presentation. My concern is increasingly academics are becoming distant from their students. Don't actually understand the questions students bring. Don't want to understand the worlds from which they come. Don't want to engage with them. I'm here to teach you not to be your parents. I'm here for you to pass the exam. Oh, wonderful. And we also need not only returning to first principles about fundamental principles of education, but how do we return to finding one's voice as an academic? Have you found your voice? What is your voice? What is your stand? Where do you stand? Close the epistemological distance. What are we providing as epistemological access to? A colonized education? Recovering the moral purpose of higher education. I really think this is a critical one. What is the moral purpose of why we come to work every day? Universities, quote, are in a crisis of legitimacy and a crisis of agency. Someone from Stellenbosch University. The future of the university and the impact on the new ways of learning, we're still struggling with that, aren't we? 2.5 minutes left, my goodness. The impact of a changed teaching and learning context, the dawn of the digital age. And how do we use that in a decolonized manner and way? Centering the black intellectual. Why is it that many of us only quote white academics? Why? I see it all the time, and I'm guilty of it too. How do we reimagine the higher education curriculum? Betty Leask and Hans de Wit are kind of main characters in the internationalization of higher education. They wrote an article in November, and when I read it, I became very cynical. because it's almost like, how do we deal with these people who are talking about decolonization? Let's sort them out. Does internationalization need to be decolonized? To what extent is internationalization of higher education a colonial tool? What are the politics below internationalization? And what is the moral purpose of internationalization? I'm not going to say more there. There's a lot more to say. The curriculum is inextricably entwined with our institutional culture, and I've spoken about that already. How we behave as a university and our culture affects the curriculum in enormous ways. What about the epistemic violence between the text narratives and learning and the lived lives of black students? Black students often in the lecture room are treated as the other, and they cannot bring their own lived experience from where they come from together with what it is they're learning about. And academics don't help to bridge that, don't help to mediate that, and put the two into dialogue and conversation in all their contradictions. That's Savo Heleta from NMU in Port Elizabeth. Engaging by progressive leadership in taking a decolonial stance. That's for all of our university leaders, but it's also for all of us too. Identifying pockets of excellence in our universities, where somebody's really doing something, promoting it, making it happen, and getting colleagues, and that's probably the hardest, into this curriculum transformation conversation. Education has to become emancipatory and contribute to the democratic project. This includes debating the meanings and origins of science knowledge and knowledge per se to advance decolonization. It's time to redefine the center. It's the fundamental question of place, perspective, and orientation in the curriculum. By the way, this presentation will be available to you if you want to look at it. So I see some people photographing. You're probably saying, oh, there's an interesting quote I'd like to use. So to round off now, I'm landing the aeroplane. Any artists in the room? Painters? There's one at the back. Well, if you're like me, I'm really not good at that. I think God left me out of that particular game. But there's a picture, and you know that thing, paint by numbers. You know, so we have all the numbers to transform the curriculum, to transform our institutions, to do this, to do that. We kind of have a sense of what we need to do. But you know what? You know, it's not just filling in the numbers. It's more than that. It's really an art. And therefore, what I'm talking about is not just technique. It's not just having knowledge about it. It's not having a methodology. But it's a fundamental change of our hearts, of our dispositions, of our values, as we engage with decolonizing our minds and who we are, so that we can actually produce a work, well, people call that a work of art. I'll leave it like that. So in conclusion, to quote Emmanuel Ngara, who wrote the book The African University in 1995, the aim is to create new men and women who have not only acquired skills, but whose attitude to life has changed, who are conscious of the African predicament and the potential that the continent has, who realize that development means transforming nature and the environment, that human beings are the primary agent of change, that knowledge gives them the capacity to move mountains and to make spring water flow in a desert. Is that what we are doing? Is that what we should be thinking about doing? If there's any takeaway from this is, let's begin to change our minds, change our hearts, think differently, engage with each other, have the hard conversations. I met with the Institutional Forum at TUT a couple of weeks ago, and I said, you know, this transformation thing is really hard. I don't really kind of fully grasp it. And one of the persons, an external member to the university, said, well, why are you bothering even talking to us then if you don't know what it's all about? It is complex, it's hard. Transformation, curriculum transformation, decolonization, Africanization, becoming decent human beings, leaders of society, ethical, it's all of that. I thank you for your time and your patience.